All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Erin Carmone. I'm a senior correspondent at New York Magazine. I wrote a book called Notorious RBG, working on a book called Unbearable about the pregnancy care crisis in America. So I am so thrilled to be here today with old friends, new friends, people that I'm learning from. I'm thrilled to be sharing the stage with these panelists. In the interest of, it's been a really full day. We've had incredible conversations. In the interest of keeping it moving, please don't clap until the end. I know that our panelists are going to say many clap-worthy things, but I want to hear from them as much as possible, and I promise I'm not going to be talking very much at all. And I'm looking forward to a free-flowing conversation. We have a very diverse set of professional backgrounds here, but everybody here shares the commitment to democratic participation, to the right of all people to have access to healthcare and have their voices heard in every sense. And so I want to jump into it. I'm going to quickly introduce them. Next to me is Chi-Sun Lee. She's the Director of Elections and Government Program at the Brennan Center here. She focuses on campaign finance, and she's going to talk a little bit about it. Next to her is Dr. Jamila Parrott. She's the CEO and President of Physicians for Reproductive Health. She's also an OBGYN. We're thrilled to have a clinician on the panel. She's an expert in family planning and abortion care. Next to her is Ria Tobacco Mar. She is the director of the ACLU's Women's Rights Project, of course, the successor to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She leverages litigation to fight gender stereotypes, sex segregation, and attempts to use religion. She litigates against, she does not attempt to, she litigates against attempts to use religion to discriminate in schools and at work and public places. And finally, but not least, Victoria Norse, who is the Georgetown Law Ralph V. Whitworth Professor of Law, Director of the Center on Congressional Studies. She is a leading scholar on Congress and separation of powers. She's worked throughout government. And we have Victoria to thank for the original Violence Against Women Act, and you can read about it in the incredible book, Equal, Women Reshaped the Law. So just to set the stage a little bit, having had the opportunity to hear all of the panels from before, in particular the conversation between Melissa and Jessica, I was thinking about how you could say that the opponents of women's rights actually practice their own form of intersectionality, which is that they realize that all of these issues are deeply interconnected, that if they can control who can vote, who can make medical decisions, who has autonomy over their lives, if they can inject billions of dollars unaccountably into the political process, if they can rewrite the map literally to favor a minority interest, they will be able to, here's this phrase, backslide. So they see these, and this was said, but I think it can't be underlined enough. They see the interconnections of these issues in reinforcing a gendered hierarchy and a racialized hierarchy. So it falls on people who have different values to also see those connections, as we have been doing today. The other thing is that we have this word backsliding in our title. And there's another related word that I think is really important, which is backlash. And in listening to these stories from the international panel this morning, I was thinking about these attacks on democracy and on women's rights took place in response to increased autonomy of more people, especially women, but not only women, also Indigenous people and other minorities, and ways in which people agitating for their progress or the kinds of wins that we are familiar with as part of the American story have been met with this kind of fierce resistance. It is precisely because people were starting to win that these attacks have happened, and they have figured out how to work the process. So that's another thing I'm thinking about. Melissa referred to this part of Dobbs where she said, Justice Alito cites the deeply rooted history and traditions of America, and Riva Siegel had a piece that I'm just gonna, I think, really connects everything that we're talking about here, where she talks about how we're going back to, this is a notion that is going back to history and traditions from a time where the law did not protect a wife's right to control property, earnings, or sex in marriage. states denied women the right to practice law. Only white men's legal rights were recognized. This was very soon after slavery was enshrined in America, legal in America. So we are thinking about our people who are nostalgic about a time in which many of the people in this room, some more than others, would not have had the ability to do what we're doing now. And we're seeing their vision of the future, which is more of a restoration of that time. So it is in light of that I'm going to shut up and turn to the panelists and ask them just really briefly, I know each of you could just give an incredible speech, but I want you to be in conversation with each other, 2 or 3 minutes to set the stage of where you're coming from in your work and how you're thinking about this profound backlash and backsliding and the connection between democracy and women's rights. Yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. What a luxury to be gathered here, to be able to focus on ourselves, our challenges, our work. I want to thank my former colleague and the brilliant leader of today, Jennifer Weiss-Wolf, and Professor Melissa Murray for hosting us here and creating an occasion that is just too rare to be in company together, learning from each other and being energized by each other. It's just incredible. Now, Erin promised me I'd be able to talk about the good news later, so I'm going to jump into the bad news right now. Among other things, my work focuses on political process reform to create more equitable pathways to official power. So I'm going to make a basic point, but it's a frustratingly stubborn one. Our power, women's power as decision makers in the political process, does not reflect our numbers or our needs. Just to say a couple more basic things, who holds legislative or executive office, and whether we do so in critical mass numbers and with agenda-setting authority obviously matters tremendously to the design, the enactment, the implementation, and the enforcement of laws that can help us or harm us. And that includes, of course, the power to select the judges who interpret these laws. I'm going to invite you to close your eyes just for 10 seconds with me and imagine a woman whose leadership you greatly admire. And I hope many, if not most of you, are imagining yourselves and somebody sitting next to you. Imagine if these women were the President of the United States, the Majority Leader of the US Senate, the Speaker of the House, and the chairs of powerful congressional committees. That might not be sufficient to achieve full equality for women, but I'm just gonna go out on a limb and say we'd probably be better off. Of course, and open your eyes, unless like this is a real moment to just like rest and just take in the moment. That picture is not currently the case. Even with really significant gains in the past 20 years, we remain significantly underrepresented at all levels of elected office. We are, of course, more than half of the general population, but we hold less than 1/3 of seats in Congress, in state legislatures, and in state executive offices. And I read one study that estimated, based on very sophisticated statistical models, that even at the historic rates of victory that women saw in Congress in 2018, it would take more than 3 decades longer to reach full representation compared to our proportion of the population. And of course, women of color are much more sharply underrepresented compared to our numbers in the population. But put another way, this was an interesting psychological study that I recently read. White men are dramatically overrepresented in positions of official power. As of 2020, which is the last count I have, white men held 62%, nearly 2/3 of seats in the House, even though they're just 30% of the general population. So, of course, a major reason for this significant political underrepresentation is the historical and systematic exclusion of women, even more so women of color, from the economic and social opportunities and networks that lead to access to political leadership under the status quo system. But the problem is also the status quo system, which is a political process that really hasn't evolved since the time when the assumption was that elected leaders would be wealthy white men. So one piece of that I look at, and Professor Murray brought up many during the lunch conversation that we could talk about, but one of the pieces that I look at is campaign finance. The ability to attract enormous sums of money or self-finance enormous sums of money is a major factor, not just to win, but also well before that, to be on the radar of party leaders as someone to recruit, to coach, to put up for primaries. And even after winning, campaign finance power is a prerequisite often to being considered by party leaders for legislative leadership positions where you're able to set the agenda. You know, a colleague of mine, Maya Kornberg, who's a political scientist, recently wrote a piece pointing out that currently there are more House committee chairs named Mike than there are women committee chairs, which is a nice light way for us to absorb the situation we're in right now. And I feel Erin saying, like, move it. Okay. I'm just gonna to have us picture, like,
I was told to make it conversational. I'm sorry.
What would it take for one of us to do this? The average cost of a U.S. Senate campaign in the 2022 midterms, the average cost was $13 million. The average cost of a House campaign was nearly $2 million. Those are just averages. In competitive races, the amounts are much, much more. And generally, the bigger fundraiser wins the race in a competitive contest. So it's not that women can't raise competitive sums and win and attain legislative leadership. The hill is much steeper for us. We need to collect our money in much smaller increments for many more donors. We need to be breakout stars on Twitter, and that sometimes creates that sort of problem for democracy that we could talk about separately. And of course, fundraising is the biggest barrier for women of color. We recently did a study of 4 House general election cycles. Women of color raised less on average than all other candidates, and we're only 4% of candidates, even though we're nearly a quarter of the population. So to sum up, campaign finance is one of the enormous barriers to equal political opportunity for women. It's an election problem. Before that, it's a pipeline problem. And after that, it is an agenda setting problem. And I would love to talk about a little glimmer of hope at some point.
Thank you so much. So Dr. Parrott, you told me before we started that I don't need to go down the line. However, I do have a segue, which is that one of the precedents that was wiped out with the Dobbs decision was the Casey decision that had a line that said that the ability of women to participate in help me out, Professor Murray, but the ability of women to participate in life or in public life in the country, help me out, but it was about the ability to participate in life as you see fit rests on the ability to control your reproduction. So this is another connection between the democratic process and reproductive freedom. If you are denied even this basic right to decide, to make decisions about your family, whether it's to have a baby or not, when to have a baby, how can you be heard in the political process? And perhaps that's by design. And so in addition to running this organization, you are also a clinician. So I'm wondering if you can put it into context, both in the advocacy work that you do and in seeing patients, what's on your mind?
So many things are on my mind.
Take my mic.
Thank you. Hello, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for the invitation. Are there any clinical providers in the room? Midwives, doulas, doctors, nurses? No, that's not unusual, right? For me in these conversations, I am frequently the only the only clinician, the only woman, the only Black woman in almost all of the spaces. And so I sit with that and I take that responsibility really seriously. Every time I open my mouth to speak, I know that it's an opportunity to transform the world around me, but also to radicalize folks in the room in the same ways that I have been in my life. My name is Dr. Jamila Parrott. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an OBGYN. I'm an abortion provider in the city that I grew up in, the city that made me, which is intentional. And I lead an organization called Physicians for Reproductive Health. We're a network, a national network of doctors around the country advocating, leveraging our privilege and power that comes with the white coat to shape advocacy, policy, legislation, narratives for the communities that we serve, with the belief that when folks have the agency and autonomy, the human right to make decisions about their bodies and their lives, that it becomes an opportunity to control their destiny. You know, I sat through the morning, not sort of, I sat through the morning and then even the introduction and really thought quite a bit about not just what I wanted to say, but what I thought you all needed to hear, because sometimes those aren't the same things, right? I think I'll start with what abortion does and what it doesn't do. I had a colleague who told me years ago, also an abortion provider, who said that the reason she provides abortions is because she believes it is a pathway to the middle class. For whom? When I do abortions on young people in DC, it doesn't mean that they're going to get admitted to NYU School of Law and a seat on the Supreme Court. It is not a pathway out of poverty for many, many people, because it is not pregnancy that causes poverty, right? And we have to look at that reciprocal relationship. It isn't necessarily liberatory for everyone. And for the vast majority of people, it's something that they would rather not be doing in this moment. And I think that we can acknowledge and support the desire for reproductive freedom and also understand deeply that this can be challenging for some folks as they're navigating it. I think the other thing that's really important to talk about, and something that I was really deeply grateful to hear in the panel from this morning, is an appreciation, acknowledgement, and understanding of the role of Black feminism and womanism in this movement, the way that it has been undervalued, under-resourced, and how that is directly related to the moment that we're in right now. I'm a doctor. I said that, I think, right? And I've always wanted to be a doctor. I don't remember ever wanting to be anything else. But I also grew up in DC, and it is nearly impossible to live in DC and not feel the weight and the specter of politics on your life. And it is impossible, it is truly impossible to be a young Black girl in the 80s in DC during the war on drugs and not know who was destroying our communities by design. And so for me, this connection to medicine and policy has been a necessity, because I believe that it is one way, not the only way, but one way to move us closer to the liberatory future that we say that we seek. But the challenge is that so many of our conversations have been held in a race-blind way. And I did, because I've been forced into your rooms over the last 10 years, not that I don't like y'all, I knew I needed to learn more about how you all were thinking and what you were doing, right? How you all were approaching the issue. It felt so distant and divergent from clinical care. And so I spent a couple summers ago some time in the African American Policy Forum CRT summer school, to try to understand this connection between race and law and how you all are ideating it and iterating it and thinking about it and holding it and stretching it and dealing with the tension and the balance. And it was such an aha moment for me. And there was a comment that was made during that session that said, race-bound conditions cannot be changed with race-blind policies. And so as we move through this panel today, I want to offer for you to racialize every single thing that is said. We cannot attempt to achieve, we can't invoke Black feminisms and the organizing from the margins, and if Black women were free, everyone would be free, and then continue to have a conversation in a race-blind way. Those things are misaligned. When we're talking about intersectionality, we're not talking about identities. We're talking about oppressions. We all have 1,000 intersecting identities. That is not the point. The point is that some of us experience unique oppressions along those lines of identity, and that is the point of leverage when we're thinking about what solutions look like. And then I think, it's also important to interrogate this, what I believe, and this maybe is an unpopular opinion in this room, is an undeserved allegiance to democracy. This democratic process was not written with me in mind. So the idea that me, my community, the folks that I love and care for in the city that I grew up in the community that I serve, would then hold democracy and the democratic process in such high esteem, to me, is a foreign notion, and it's diluted. And so we have a lot of work to do to understand how we can engage many communities, including patients and medical communities, in this conversation about the backsliding of democracy. Is it a backslide if it never belonged to you? How can you lose what you never had? And so that is the question I think I was sitting with this morning as I sat through the panels, and what the energy that I brought to the stage with me to think about what it means to create a new system. The last thing that I'll say, because I'm pretty sure I'm out of time, is that, for those of us who have been particularly in the reproductive justice space, right? It's debatable for reproductive health and reproductive rights. But those of us who have been doing RJ work have known that this moment was coming since Roe was passed in 1973, and y'all let Hyde slip through. We knew you didn't care about us, and that we were not centered in this fight. And so we knew that this was coming, not tomorrow or next week, right? But we knew it was coming down the line, because they're not creative in their attacks. And so for us to see this play out, and it does not mean that we are not still devastated and don't understand that it will get so much worse for our communities before it gets better. But there was not some deep-seated betrayal by the government that allowed this to play out, because it was never on our side in the first place. And we've always had to be alchemists to create something out of nothing for a country that has never valued us. I recognize that is not the question you asked me. But I will say this: if my congressional testimonies have taught me nothing, it's answer the questions that you want to answer and not the ones that they put before you. So there you go.
I'm very glad you did. Thank you for that. I appreciate your honesty and all of the words that you just said. The question was just a segue. Rhea, keeping abortion very much at the center here, but not only talking about abortion. I'm wondering if you could lay out the work that you're doing and how you're thinking about it in terms of the larger themes that have been brought up today.
I think, yes, hello. I have succeeded in turning the microphone on, so that's 50% of showing up at a panel. Congratulations to all of us who've made it this far. Victoria, we'll see how you do. This is a great question, and I'm tempted to take a page from Jamila's book and just pick up on some of the strands I've heard already. I came in midway through the lunchtime chat, and I'm sorry that I missed any part of today's conversation because there are so many threads I wanted to respond to already. Thinking about the connection between RBG and the political process, one of RBG's most famous quotes, of course, was in response to the question, when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court? And we all know she said, right, when there are 9. There have been 116 justices in the United States Supreme Court, and 108 of them have been white men. So I think perhaps maybe the better answer is, like, when there have been 108, then we can start to talk. And that's really the connection, right? Who is on the court and how do we separate the who from the what? We can't. When you think about the quote from the Reva Siegel article you read earlier, which I love, but it also in some ways accepts Justice Alito's characterization of the right as the right to abortion. And that's how he sees it, right? But that's really another way of saying who is exercising the right to reproductive autonomy, because white heterosexual property owning men have always in this country had autonomy over when and whether to start a family. So the question is not, is that right deeply rooted in American tradition, but who has had the freedom to exercise that right? Certainly not enslaved Black women, right? Certainly not women of frankly, pretty much any race or class up until relatively recently. And even then, it was only a small fraction of women who could really exercise that freedom, going back to this access point. So it's not.
And why is that the question?
Right. So who can access that freedom? And why are we counting on these 108 white men to choose out of their noblesse oblige to share with us the freedom they are reserving for themselves? Right? Because that is what they are doing. They are reserving the freedom for themselves. They are retrenching the freedom for themselves. And they're saying quite clearly, you were never in, you're still out, right? That's the barometer. The same could be said for so many other fundamental rights, since you did ask me to talk about something, not just abortion, but you think about the freedom to marry. How do we think about the freedom to marry? Well, who wasn't allowed to marry? Enslaved people weren't allowed to marry. And then same-sex couples weren't allowed to marry. But some people always had the freedom to marry the person of their choosing, and to do so in a way that was recognized by the state. So this question of how can we separate the who from the what, and this sleight of hand the court is playing by defining rights by the who, and then saying, if you were out at the beginning, you're still out now, rather than asking, what is the freedom we're all seeking to arrange our lives with autonomy, with dignity and respect, all things they've claimed for themselves and would deny to the rest of us. I do feel like we should have a little bit of good news, maybe earlier in the panel, because I know Chisun has some good news too, but I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the conversation between the court and pregnancy outside of the abortion context, because we did have a major victory last year in the pregnancy space, the passage of the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which is a really big deal, and it's the first federal law that protects pregnancy since 1978. And the thing that is interesting to me, or maybe to this group, about the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act is it's the first time we've seen Congress address pregnancy from an equity perspective and not just from an equality frame, right? So before the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, we had the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, which essentially told employers, you can't treat pregnant workers worse than you treat anyone else. You are still, however, free to treat everyone poorly. And if we know anything about this country, it's that those in power, right, will destroy public goods rather than share them with anyone. And so here we are, right, saying you can treat everyone poorly, and that is going to redound very differently on people who can be pregnant, who may be pregnant multiple times in their career, right? The compounding impact of that is just going to be different on some people than others, even though in some sense there's the equality of the dregs, right? We're just treating everyone poorly, but the impact on that is going to look very different based on who you are. The Pregnant Workers Fairness Act adopts an equity in the frame in the sense that it requires employers to actually ask, what do pregnant workers need to be able to keep working? And in most cases, they're going to have to provide that. And so this, in some ways, got buried, I think, in the really, really terrible news of 2022. And I want to lift it up for everyone in this room, because when we think about like talking about abortion, yeah, talk about abortion, but also like we have to talk about pregnancy. We have to normalize pregnancy. We have to normalize the fact that pregnant people work and parent and do all kinds of things. We vote. We could sit on the Supreme Court. Let's have a pregnant justice, right? So let's talk about all these things, and let's celebrate the places where we do have wins, because the fight for the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act was, I mean, in some ways it's been a fight since 1978, but really sort of coalesced in the last decade or so. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it finally passed in the same year that we got the Dobbs decision. And maybe it's because we're talking about pregnancy. Maybe it's because some folks felt guilty that, okay, if we're going to force somebody to continue a pregnancy, we can't also force them out of a job. I don't know. But whatever it was, right? Maybe it was just that folks who support reproductive autonomy felt like they had to stand up and actually do something to support pregnant workers. And this was the thing that was there that advocates had said is going to be really, really critical, particularly for low-wage workers, particularly for Black workers, particularly for people who are in the kinds of jobs where they can and routinely are denied things like the ability to carry a water bottle with them at work, the ability to sit down on a stool when you're working behind the cash register. Right? These are the kinds of accommodations we're talking about. And these are the kind of accommodations that employers in America have long felt, have had the legal right to simply deny to everyone. So this is my little glimmer of good hope. I'm trying to inject it early in the panel so we have something to celebrate. Hopefully we'll hear some more good news from Chisun later, but I'll stop there.
Go ahead, Victoria.
Well, have I turned this on? I don't know. All right. Well, I've been inspired. I want to thank the organizers of this and Professor Murray, who's positively a phenom in the legal world, for having this event, because I think it's a very important connection. I also have to say, however, something that might be a little bit distracting, which is that the president has named me the vice chair of the United States Civil Rights Commission, and nothing I'm about to say has anything to do or on behalf of the commission. I'm there to support a wonderful woman who actually ran for office for Attorney General of Texas. Her name is Rochelle Garza, and a leader in the reproductive rights movement. She hopefully will be elected chair next week. So this is going to be my very depressing take. And it has nothing to do with my hope for bipartisanship in the future. My very depressing take is that authoritarianism thrives on violence. I agree entirely with the good doctor, and it should take a doctor to tell you that lawyers idealize democracy in a way we shouldn't. But we are facing a new post-Me Too, and I've worked on violence against women in all sorts of forms. I include many things that are now happening in the realm of reproductive rights in that genre. But we're witnessing a moment where, when I testified on behalf of the ERA, the members put me in front of the press and said, what do you think the Supreme Court's going to do? And this is before Dobbs. And I said, be afraid. And I didn't quite know why I said that. But it's because I study how the Supreme Court decides decisions, its methods. And I knew, based on my work on the methods, that Dobbs was going to come down, that it was the way it would. That's because there is authoritarianism, thrives in a soup, and literally it's a soup because they're not logical, of ideas that the powerful justify violence, rationalize violence. Now, the Supreme Court, although there are two slight exceptions, you all know who they are, is not a set of people who think that they're violent, and they're not discriminatory against women. But they have a theory that has been used to justify real violence. And what I mean by that is not Robert Cover, who's famous at Yale for saying, the courts are violent in some theoretical way. I mean real violence to human beings and to democracy, and that they're connected. So on January 6th, by my house on Capitol Hill, marched a whole bunch of people. And there was a legal theory that supported what they were doing. That legal theory is called originalism and textualism. And that theory says, go back to 1868, go back to 1792, when people were enslaved, women couldn't vote, women could not even be lawyers. Women could not run for office, couldn't be on juries. And it was much worse for women of color. But we shared that. That's where they want to take us. And that was the theory that supported the insurrection. Am I crazy for that? No. The theory of the insurrection was, Donald Trump, the guy who said, I'm going to grab him by the pussy, I have all executive power. Where did he get that from? Justice Scalia. He wrote it in a dissent in a case called Morrison versus Olson. In that dissent, he said the president didn't have some executive power, he had all executive power. And Donald Trump wielded that like a sword. That's why he riled up that crowd. He would justify anything. That is the kind of thing that my mother's generation, the greatest generation who fought World War II, Rosie the Riveter, would say was totalitarian. The president doesn't have all executive power. That's not even what the text says. It doesn't have all in it. They added that with a caret. So there was a legal theory that justified that, and that legal theory then went on to justify why they were trying to change the election. That guy named John Eastman, his theory was, well, I'm going to disregard the rule of law. I'm going to disregard the statute that says, this is a ceremonial matter of counting these certificates in Congress. And I'm going to go to a higher law, which of course they always do. I'm going to go to the Constitution. And I'm going to say the vice president has all power to determine election, to set the rules of how the Senate and the House count the electoral ballots. And guess what? That same theory, why would I say be afraid? That same theory justifies Dobbs. Now, originalists will deny this, but that's why it's a soup of ideas. It's not necessarily consistent. It's often, as Professor Murray said, they use racial tropes and saying, I'm being not racist, to do things that are racist. I wrote a book about eugenics, a case called Skinner versus Oklahoma. This whole business about eugenics is backwards. So there's a connection between an authoritarian idea of the presidency, the power of the elites on this court. And there are three of them that Justice Trump put there. So I am afraid. What I do is try to fight those ideas. I do it by going to the States, as Melissa said, and I'm trying to get people interested in that these things are connected. Because the way you get to the Supreme Court is obviously through the Senate. So we talked about electoral. The guy, what's the thing about Mike? Wow, I love that line. When I was in the Senate, I had to go to the library to get women. The library where I pulled Ruth Bader Ginsburg off the shelf. So we need to respond in all fronts, because we need a Supreme Court. We need the rule of law. I don't want to live in Russia. I don't want to live in Afghanistan. I just met a lovely woman from Afghanistan. I'm sorry I didn't hear her this morning. We need the rule of law. We need an honest Supreme Court. But Sheldon Whitehouse, if he were here, would say it's been bought. And it's been bought based on a theory that I believe is at its core anti-democratic. So I think we need to fight on all fronts. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I want to engage in a conversation that plays off of something that Dr. Parrott said, which is, how did we get here? What were the mistakes that were made? And you identified a few. One that comes up, what comes to mind is the under-resourcing of people who came up with the ideas that are really animating a lot of the conversation, Black feminists, intersectionality. I promise we'll talk about positive stuff at the end, but we're here to really talk about a crisis. What were some of the mistakes that were made, and how in this particular era can people, with different values, these values of democracy, or at least political participation, equality, gender justice, how can we avoid making these mistakes again?
I'm going to start, if that's okay. So one of the things that I've really been sitting with is the way that we conflate unity and uniformity. The idea that if we had more women on the Supreme Court, or more women in power, or more women in leadership position, that it would necessarily mean that we were moving toward a more equitable world. I take issue with that. We've seen the election results. We know how white women vote. And so from the idea that I should put my faith in that as an opportunity for change, it does not ring true for me. And so when we think about mistakes and sort of how we, not just mistakes, but like what a way forward looks like, for me, it is deeply disconnecting that conflation. We need to be united for sure, right? And moving in the same direction, right? That is why we are, in theory, a movement, not because we are all the same, doing the same thing, coming from the same place, going in the same direction. Loretta Ross told me that's a cult. That's not a movement, right? A movement is people who are approaching the work from different angles, who are showing up in different ways with different experiences, but our end goal, our North Star, is the same. I don't know how convinced I am that everybody's North Star is the same, but that's probably another panel to discuss, right? But I think, if we can align ourselves around this goal, understanding what liberation looks like, I think that brings us closer. And the tricky part about that, right, visioning a liberatory future, is that white supremacy is really good at doing a number of things, right? We often think about it in terms of the impact on Black folks and folks of color in particular, but it has a deep impact on everybody. One of the greatest challenges and problems that white supremacy has created is it has robbed people of their imagination. You can't even dream of a world that looks like anything other than the one where you remain at the top. And you don't say that I'm at the top. Maybe I'm at the middle. I'm not at the bottom, though. So it's not that bad. It's bad, but it's not that bad. The reason why I was so deeply drawn to RJ organizing spaces is because it was the first time in my career where I was offered an opportunity to dream, to say not what is now, but what do we want if we had everything? What could it be? Who could we be in a world that looked like that? So the path to liberation, and the tricky part is that I think that they have convinced white women wholesale that y'all are free. Not free, right? But freer than me, freer than some folks. Right? And so when you buy into that delusion, it compromises your ability to dream. You're not free, you're loose. Those are two different things. And so understanding for yourself, can you tell me, what does liberation look like for you? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? Can you define that for yourself? If you don't know what that looks like for you, how can you be charged with building a liberatory future for me, for anybody else?
I'm waiting for you. You guys don't have to wait for me. Just go, jump in.
Well, I'm very inspired, and I'm delighted that we have a doctor on the panel, particularly one who lives in D.C. And I'm sure she felt the way I felt in some ways, but even worse.
Not at the clinic either.
Oh, really?
There were not. It was wiped out. The clinic was empty in terms of protesters, and there are hundreds that are typically there on January 6th. There were none there, and that is not by coincidence.
What a sad day. But they are connected. This is connected. It is real. It's not just some theory I'm spouting here. I'm done with legal theory.
They deeply understand the connections, is what I was
Yeah.
trying to say.
Yeah.
They understand.
And
what's
I'm
at stake for
inspired
them.
by this because I think that, I got to say, I do often dream. One of my good friends is a woman named Dorothy Brown. She recently wrote a book. She's a tax lawyer. She gets best professor every year teaching corporate tax at 8:30. I'm so envious. And we got to know each other at Emory, but, she's taught me so much about what it might be to dream, because she wrote a book called The Whiteness of Wealth, about how the tax law, of all things, can be racist and is racist. And she's helped me dream because of the conversations we've had, and dream about a world, once upon a time, the Irish were a race, the Italians were a race. Women like my mother gave up her job teaching to have children. I dream of a world where we really, individuality remains, but we get really beyond that, and population change will help us in that way.
Can I just take you back to the question of, how did we get here? What are some of the mistakes we
Right.
made? How do we think about a better future?
Well, I also believe in unity. I believe that I hate to say this, but there's an old saw on Capitol Hill: liberals eat their own. They're very negative. And women have certainly had their problems. They've had their real problems with race. I have no faith that just, women who are not aligned on an intersectional, diverse basis are going to do anything. Look at the votes. But I do think we fought each other too much. I think women have fought each other way, way, way too much. I think we have to align with men who understand our vision. And this is somewhat of a sidelight, but maybe not. The second gentleman teaches at Georgetown Law School. Like the former second lady, he has a job. And I was sitting next to him yesterday, very anecdotal, because we have lunch on Wednesdays in the faculty lounge. And we were talking about the way in which the leader of the reproductive rights movement within the White House is a woman named Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States, a Black woman. She's a powerful woman. And he was shocked at how she's been treated in the press, how she's been treated by other women aspirants in office, and that's because of her race, he thinks. But he's an ally, is what I'm trying to say overall. He's an ally. And I think we need to know who our allies are, that it's not necessarily by gender. And we need to understand that moving forward, as someone said, and I think maybe Professor Murray or Jessica Valenti, you got to swarm those polls. Democracy it's like a boat where you're constantly, it's got a hole in the bottom built on slavery, and you've got to constantly keep reconstructing that while you're sailing. And that Constitution, it's not a democratic Constitution. It's got the Senate, right? So the only way to save it is to try to reconstruct it as you're going. So it's hard, but the only way to do that ultimately is to be inspired. And the one good thing, I'll tell you just one good thing and then I'll let you go. There is a hydraulic system. The Constitution doesn't really make the court supreme, although constitutional law professors always say the court is supreme because they say what the law is, Marbury versus Madison. That ain't true. You ask President Biden, he'll say, I say what the law is. You ask Congress, they'll say, I say what the law is. That's baloney. The court does not control democracy. Democracy has often roared back. So when democracy roars back, it will be heard in some way on this court. We'll just have to see how that happens.
I wonder if listening to what you're saying, part of it is also just pinning less faith on the courts, as historically has been done.
We did make that mistake. We pinned too much faith on the court. That was a deep mistake. I love RBG, but she was a dissenter, people, dissenter. And I've been disappointed, I have to say, although Justice Kagan marshaled her inner Holmes in this case called West Virginia versus EPA, the climate change case. They're getting the message, and I have great hope for Justice Jackson. But they got to start fighting too. But in the interim, realize that most of your rights. I wrote something after Saturday Night Live did the send up of Dobbs with the medieval haircuts, and we're going back to the 13th century. We don't have any rights except the right to vote. The court could take them all away. They've interpreted the 14th Amendment that way. And that, if you know anything about your history, was for Black men. Now, we might see the 13th Amendment as protecting Black women because slavery was built on the systematic violence and rape of Black women. But the 14th Amendment doesn't include white women. White women were very racist about that at the time. So your only rights come from Congress that you think you have, the 1964 civil rights, et cetera.
Ria Chisen, I wonder if you can talk about some of the ways we can learn from past mistakes that got us to this crisis point we're talking about.
Well, I was going to offer a much more literal answer to your question, so I'm just going to bring it back to the very granular. And I inspired, I think, in part by your reference to the Hyde Amendment, which absolutely was a tell. And I think it was more than a tell, right? It was kind of the whole thing in a way, because that was access for so many people, certain people. But I was going to talk about the court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder, restricting, eliminating the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. And to be clear, this idea of the backslide, right? It's not just that those who seek to constrain and shrink democracy see the connection, right, between patriarchy and non-representative government. That was the whole point, right? The whole point of ending preclearance, blessing ever greater restrictions on the ability to vote, green lighting, partisan gerrymandering, right? All of that was to get us to this moment that we got to rather quickly, I think, just 10 years after the decision in Shelby County, where we would have these profoundly undemocratic state governments that we could then say, we are going to turn the ability to decide about abortion. We're going to give that decision back to the states that we have gerrymandered and allowed to be so unrepresentative. I mean, when you look at polling today, I think there are fewer than 10, maybe we're at 6 or 7 states where actually, if you polled a majority of people, you'd have support for any kind of restriction really on abortion. But of course, we all know there are many more than 6 states that have passed such bans. And that right there is the disconnect between sort of the will of the people who live in a state and the folks that have been allowed to claim power for themselves in a way, again, precisely to entrench that. So it's not just that things are connected. That was, I think,
it was the point.
That was the point. It was the whole point. It's a feature, not a bug.
And I think Jessica mentioned Mississippi trying to make a referendum, like block the possibility of a referendum on abortion. Hopefully I'm restating that correctly. Happy anniversary, 10 years since Shelby County. It's also, I think this year is 10 years, or maybe it's been 11 years since Mississippi voted simultaneously on personhood and voter ID, right? And personhood failed for the time that it did, and voter ID passed. And Mississippi, of course, later goes on to pass the law that overturns Roe v. Wade, and it took less than 10 years. So we can see, and I know that there were many people who fought hard to stop it. I think Loretta Ross wrote about the inability of these campaigns to work together. It was one nail in the coffin, and there were many nails, but I think it was a moment where they happened to be in the same ballot to think about, okay, what could have been. She said, where are some places where you see in the campaign finance and the democratic process more broadly that, how can we not avoid making the same mistake again?
Yeah, thank you. And I think I'm going to drill down into sort of a microcosm, sort of building on what Dr. Parrott was really opening us with this question, and talking about an advocacy campaign that I had the great privilege and the great fun of being a part of here in New York State. Something that happened around a law that we got passed in New York State in 2020 to push back at the problem of campaign finance as one of the barriers to greater power for women and people of color in the official political process. In 2020, we got a law passed to create a public campaign financing program in New York State for state legislative and state executive offices. And it is currently in effect for the 2024 state legislative cycle. And in a nutshell, public campaign financing is a voluntary program where the small contributions from constituents will be multiplied by a match of public money to candidates who choose to participate in this program. But the thing about the campaign, the coalition that won this law against a powerful incumbency that does not want to see the democratic process that they currently hold change, is how multi-issue and multiracial the coalition was. And in the beginning, when we were sitting around in a secret meeting among leaders of different organizations talking about what seemed a very obscure issue, campaign finance and public financing, there were heads of repro rights groups, there were heads of criminal justice reform groups, there were heads of major labor unions, and one of the political director of one of the major labor unions that historically was the most progressive and first to organize building workers and other occupations that were typically occupied by Black and immigrant workers. She said, listen, campaign finance, public financing, that is not our core issue. Our core issue is dignity and fair wage for everybody. But it's our first issue today because that's what's going to open up the political process to more of us, community leaders. I mean, I would love to vote for you to hold political office, or another leader in the community, a teacher, a community organizer. So it sounds like a small incremental intervention, but these things are possible, but only, I think, when different organizations and different people can see a way to connect the systems of power through the main issues that we may be the daily experts on and come from different areas of lived expertise. It could be educational expertise, very specialized medical expertise, but get together in that room, whether it's metaphorical or literal, and say, okay, we know that our first thing that we would talk about on TV might not be this, but we know that this is one necessary step that we can take together, and we're not going to get it unless we work together to move the needle a little bit. And I'm going to stop now, but I'll just, the state public financing law that I just talked about is actually, at the moment, under some threat. There are some incumbents who are getting cold feet and wanting to delay the program. So if anyone here happens to be a New York State resident and feels so inclined, maybe consider contacting your state representative and saying, please don't delay this empowering program, keep it on the books.
Thank you so much for saying that. I love this conversation about systems. I think that we spend a lot of time thinking about individual bad actors. We can point to Trump, we can point to Kavanaugh, we can point to these individuals, but they flourish only because they are enabled by a system that occurs. And when we think about the origin story of reproductive justice in particular, we know that it was designed and the intent behind it was for community organizing that would lead to public policy change, right? And that's exactly what you're talking about now. And so when we think about this mistake in this moment around abortion in particular, it is in fact the primacy of abortion in the reproductive rights movement that has allowed the system to continue. The devaluing and the lack of acknowledgement that the question came up like a couple of times, right? What is this really about? What is this really about? And nobody said white birth. That's what it's about. It's stratified reproduction. That is what the intention. They don't care if I have all the abortions every month. That is not what their concern is, right? This is about increasing white births. I think we heard some folks talk about the changing demographics and say it in nicer ways, much more eloquent than I, right? But that's not what this is about. We have to tell the truth and shame the devil, right? That's what the intention is here.
Can I just follow up on that, just in a positive way? I'm just hearing from you that, if you're interested in gender and race work, that's democracy work, and democracy work is race and gender work. So I was heartened by that, what you're telling me about what's happening in New York, and I think that it. So, for example, ranked choice voting, you know what that is? It applies in Alaska. That's why we have the first Native American congresswoman from Alaska ever. So although it seems hopeless, that's my one bit of hope about why this actually could align, even though we might not agree on all particular things.
And we don't have to agree on everything. Like,
I
that's
will
the
definitely
thing.
vote for you.
Yeah, I cuss too much in real life. They won't.
Change the system. Well, I'm glad you guys organically came to what I wanted to ask, which was what gives you hope. And I think you provided a really hopeful example. And again, as Dr. Parrott recognizes, we are really talking about how many of the crises came about because of folks rigging the system, changing the rules for their own benefit. And so trying to create better processes in order to have more real participation. Democracy is one word for that. It's not the only word for that. What else gives folks hope when it comes to, we've heard a few examples. I'd love to hear more because I promised that we wouldn't only be talking about bleak stuff.
I have the mic, so I'm going to keep going. Young people give me so much hope. Like, they are bold and brave and do all the things and will push and pull. I give talks and young people come up in a line behind me and roll off all of the shit I did wrong in a talk. And this is how you were offensive, and this is what was wrong, and the following things you need to shift and to change, right? That pushing of us is really critical. And understanding, though, that it is pushing to a point, because at some point we need to move out of the way. This is not our space to occupy in perpetuity. And so we will not see the change that we need unless we make room, and we make room by, there's this phrase that people say all the time about building power in communities, right? Like, that's an easy thing to agree to. Do you want to build power? Yes, we should build power in community. But power is like pie. And so you have to give up some of your slice in order to make sure that other folks have it. And that's what young people are calling for. That's what they're demanding in a way that is braver than I have seen in generations. And I'm here for all of that.
I'm sorry.
No, you go first, Shisan. I think, do you have your own mic?
No, I go.
We're rationing mics. I have one.
We're
Who
all
wants
sharing.
mine?
All right,
How
I'm
we're
jumping.
sharing.
I know. I'm jumping in, but just to say, we give me hope. All of us give me hope. I heard earlier during the lunchtime chat, Melissa referenced Justice Kagan's quip about Jonathan Mitchell sort of being some geniuses. I don't think it's so brilliant to come up with the idea of a bounty hunter scheme. I'm old enough to remember when we had bounty hunting in this country before, right? This is not new. This is not creative, and it's not all that smart, right? We can be smarter. We can be cleverer. And over time, we actually have made progress as much as we see this backslide, right? Nothing absolves us of the moral duty to keep trying and to keep pushing forward. And that's what we're all doing in this room.
Thank you. Do we have audience questions?
Can I say one more
Oh,
thing?
we're-
One
yeah.
more thing?
While we start to get the audience questions, Victoria,
Just take time for yourself. I was a bit overwhelmed coming up here, and I went out for a little run. We are all overwhelmed because the chaos is part of what's going on here. They're trying to divide and tire us all out. So take some time for yourself and think hard. You know, one of the reasons I wanted to come here is I was going to be forced to think hard by the panelists. So I want to thank everyone for having us here.
I do want you to answer the question I asked about your patients, though. Do you mind? You talked a little bit about, but if you could, I know that because you are the only clinician, I'm going to put the burden on you to ask, how are they experiencing this? I mean, I know you're working in a blue jurisdiction, but nonetheless, you're being flooded and you're seeing, the effects of January 6th. Since your patients aren't here, I'm not saying to speak for them, but I wonder if you could speak from your perspective about how people's lived experiences are being shaped by the forces we're talking about.
It's interesting, right, to think about that. I try to be very intentional in the stories I share and only share those stories with the explicit consent of the folks that I care for. But I think that you're actually absolutely right in terms of the intention coming to bear. It is designed to cause fatigue, chaos, confusion. Abortion care prior to Dobbs, prior to all of the shenanigans that have unfolded was already really fraught for many folks in the country. Not easy to obtain, it's shrouded in secrecy and shame and stigma. So folks are coming in and the space can be heavy sometimes. There is also joy and love that we never talk about in abortion care that totally exists, right? But the weight of what it means to actually physically get in front of me, the work that it takes to achieve that is no less than a miracle for most of the people that I see. When you compound it in this moment, because the confusion, it creates constant fear that abortion may be gone tomorrow. Or if your appointment is at noon and it's 8 a.m., thinking that they might shut the clinic down, which absolutely happens. I've had colleagues who were, seeing patients, the ruling came down at noon, everybody else had to go home, whether they were there for their appointment or not. So that fear, that confusion, that chaos absolutely makes it a much more challenging way to take care of people and for people to receive care. And that's what we're here to do.
Yeah, and I really appreciate you sharing that while respecting the privacy of your patients, because it's easy for us to have conversations that are very abstract. But the literal fact of folks on the day that Dobbs came down having to go home, or patient staff having to come in and tell them that they couldn't be helped because they had the bad luck of being there on that day, when they had to work so hard to get there in the first place, I think is something that we should always keep in mind.
Can I say one other thing? I don't want folks to think that it is simply these big decisions where this plays out. It happens in little decisions too. I live and practice, as I said, in DC. We had a short window, a matter of months, where DC Medicaid was voted on for coverage for abortion care for district residents. It was implemented by the will of the people, and Congress came in, Obama traded us and threw us under the bus, right? And so understanding that there is, you began the question with, I know that you live in a blue state. Know this, no state is safe. Everybody is at risk. It does not matter what color you think you live in, it is irrelevant. And for places like the district with no home rule, it is even more fraught.
Thank you for reminding us of that. And I think this week, anybody who's been following what's happening with the mifepristone decision is aware that the goal is to affect people no matter what kind of political affiliation their local government has. We have some questions here. Here's a really interesting one. This person is a federal tribunal judge who is limited in how much they can call out systemic issues. So looking for some things that can be done, and this may apply to many of you, looking for how to be a secret agent for change. What are some ways that if your position in life limits you from being perhaps as open and outspoken as the folks on this panel, how can they advocate both internally and externally?
Well, I think, let's just imagine you're on the bench in a state or a federal judge or some kind of tribunal. There are many kinds. It seems to me that it's possible to actually go behind the rhetoric, understand that the rhetoric is often just a rationalization. This is what we lawyers do all the time, which is to say, oh, your argument is wrong because you're actually trying to say X. We had an eloquent, she's a doctor, but I'm making her a lawyer now. You just passed the bar. So you can reveal the assumptions they're making. So Justice Kagan just did a brilliant job of saying that the climate change rule really, the opinion was a farce. And it was calm. There was no screaming in the opinion. She was not shouting. No, the New York Times didn't, run her dissent. But if you are careful, you can push back both on two different levels. One, the level of the doctrine, because it's manipulated. So they pick and choose text, they add their own meanings, and then they just don't use the text at all. They created this major questions doctrine out of thin air. So Kagan says, you just made that up. And she was pretty open about it. And then she went on and said, you've got an economic stake. You think this is all about economics. And that plan would have done nothing. So she outed neoliberalism, really. She kind of, I call it channeling her inner Holmes, because Holmes and Lochner said this is not Herbert Spencer's social statics. It's not for judges to do political economy, but there's often a we're in power and money story behind it. And there are kind and nice ways to say that.
And I'd love to respond to that also. I think, I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's hard to imagine being part of change in isolation. But of course, in certain occupations or positions, it takes greater creativity, maybe, in reaching out and finding connection and community. And so in terms of judging, which by definition often is isolated and isolating, a colleague of mine, Alicia Bannon, has launched this initiative at the Brennan Center to find what state courts are doing creatively with their constitutions, sometimes in really creative, progressive ways. But right now, largely in isolation, because there is not a natural community across states, but creating a platform, literally an online platform, and also I think in the organizing of it, a behind the scenes community and platform for exchanging creative legal ideas about, I would think, how to bring more humanity and principle to decision-making that doesn't just look to their Supreme Court's precedent, or doesn't just look to how they've faced those questions individually before in their careers. So I do think that sometimes we need to create and find those connections and those communities, but it's hard to imagine one person can do anything big in a lifetime to move the needle by themselves.
I don't think it's just hard, it's not possible, right? And so the individualism that we idolize in this country has led us to believe that you can do the things on your own outside of community, and that is simply false. But the tricky part when you think about how that operates under a white supremacy framework is that when problems are big, it makes you feel like you're too small. These are too many things. You want me to talk about the environment and reproductive health and economics and the wage gap and then court reform, and I can't do that. This is the bucket that I'm focused on, right? Has anybody seen that Toni Morrison movie, The Pieces I Am? So in that, they're asking her about during the time period when she was writing Beloved. And she said she was writing Beloved at night. Well, she wrote really, really early in the morning. And she was also an editor, maybe at Knopf or something, can't remember where she was. And then she was teaching, right, as well. And the interviewer asked her, how were you doing so many things, right, all of those things? And she said, it's not a bunch of different things, it's all the same thing. And that's the way that we have to understand the fight that we're in. We're not doing a bunch of different things. We're all fighting for the same thing, and that's why that fight has to be done in community. The last thing that I'll say, and this is just to put this container around what you were talking about, is what we're challenged with is this question around revolution or reform. This is not a new issue. This is every movement, right? Do you go inside? Are you inside game? Do you come from the outside? Are we burning it down? Or are we trying to restructure it and build it up? I am solidly on the burn it down side, if you couldn't tell. But I recognize that we have a deep need for people who are able to play that inside strategy. I can't. I don't have it in me. I don't know how to be quiet enough. I don't know how to go along. I don't know how to do incremental change. I want everything right now, immediately, because you owe me and it's mine, right? And so understanding that approach and how we balance it with folks who are working inside in ideally a strategic way is critical. The tricky part is to make sure that those folks who are working on the inside don't forget what their purpose is when they're there.
You know, I think that's a great moment. Victoria, you said that you wanted to say something, not on behalf of the administration, but sort of responding to what the administration is doing with respect to reproductive rights, putting you on the spot to
Yeah, well, just honestly, I mean, it's no secret. I don't speak on behalf of the administration, but it's no secret. If you Google me, you'll see that I worked for him on the Violence Against Women Act when I was the only woman in the room. And I also worked for him when his son was dying as his chief counsel when he was vice president. I think there's a misconception that that he has not been enlightened on this issue, just like he came out on gay marriage just on TV. One of the things I love about Joe Biden is that he learns, he changes. And I'll just tell you a personal story. Before he was running, I happened to be in the room. I'm not a campaign person. I don't do that stuff. I'm the little nerd who's sitting in the back. And all of a sudden someone says, well, what are you going to say about abortion? And I said, well, you know what? That's the gift that's been given to the Republican Party. And he said, she's right. So he has no hostility to women having reproductive freedom at all. He was wrong about the Hyde Amendment. He said that. On this issue, I know, VP Harris is with y'all. But frankly, these guys have New York Times never loved them. They don't get the press they deserve. They don't get the respect they deserve, in my opinion. But you don't have to like them to go out there and recognize that democracy is a gender movement and a race movement, and race and gender are democracy at this point. The point, people keep saying to me, well, don't you have your own theory of constitutional interpretation? Don't you have to have that theory? You don't have to have the perfect president or the perfect vice president. You do have to work hard and not get too exhausted by the chaos. But I just want to say to you, there are people, they appealed Judge Kaye's decision in a very fast fashion. A.G. Garland is not known for his speed. And so they're not perfect. But I think the point at this point is everyone has to let the message ring from below. Politicians respond. So
there's no way in 1 million years he would have admitted he was wrong on the Hyde Amendment were it not for movement pressure.
exactly. And a few good friends who listened to him. And I understand there's a lot of hostility to him. But that led to a lot of, I couldn't get people to even support the Violence Against Women Act. I had feminists and unfortunately the ACLU fighting me. We need to think creatively and in new ways. There's lots of tropes you get in the press that may be true or not. Start at the state level. If you don't like the president, that's fine. We focus too much on the president.
Right. Although without the president, there would be no appeal on this Fifth Circuit opinion. There would be no robust defense of mifepristone. So we can give him credit for that. Although I would question what you said about a gift to the Republicans, because as we're learning, at least in places where the process has been allowed to play out, it is not necessarily a gift to Republicans.
No, I meant that in the
anymore.
past. This is in
Right,
the past
no.
before Dobbs.
And here we are now learning that reproductive freedom is very popular. I have one more question that I think actually really, this is our final question, perfectly continues our conversation and some of the implicit themes that have come up. Should we be more shouty? Scalia transformed legal discourse by being shouty. Should Kagan and perhaps others ditch decorousness in favor of being righteously obnoxious? Quick response.
Some people need to do that.
Some people can and some people can't.
Mm-hmm.
Me being angry and shouty and righteously indignant is going to be looked at very differently than someone else. We've seen the tropes of Michelle Obama. We've seen it with Serena Williams, who are acting in similar ways. So yes, and this is a space that some folks need to step into. This is your time to shine.
I feel like we all want to leave it on that note, but I think we have seen from Justice Sotomayor in recent years dissents that come as close to shouting as Supreme Court justices do. And she's talking to us, right? We all know she's talking to us. And I think we hear her and we know that her dissent will be the voice of the future. So I think some on the court are shouting, even though maybe it really sounds more like a whisper outside of legal circles. But if you're to me, I hear her shouting. I hear her
It
shouting.
does seem clear to me that the dissent in Dobbs shows that they were reading and hearing and listening to sophisticated, thoughtful arguments and not just the usual ones that you might expect in there.
But there needs to be something here going on, which is if you talk to any member and the most sophisticated legislators in Congress, they'll say, if I'm given a choice and I want to win, and I have a choice between the substance and the rules, I'll always change the rules. And liberals have not been playing for the rules of the game on the court, which is the way legal discourse is written. They've said, oh, that doesn't matter. And it does matter. So they need to fight not only issues about race and criminal justice and abortion, they need to fight the rationalizations that got us to the point where we're nearing authoritarianism. They need to fight against the method as well.
I would just add very quickly, of course we should shout more, but with others, because we're in a moment, I think, especially after the Trump presidency, where certain people will be punished for shouting alone, whether it's in legislatures or in the streets. So I think it is about doing it in community.
Amen.
Thank you so much to all of these panelists for sharing your wisdom and telling some truths today. It's an honor to share a stage with you, and thank you everyone here for coming.
All right. Thank you, everybody. You've been here for a long time. This room has stayed crowded and standing room only the whole day. And I'm just so thrilled and honored that you have all joined us. I'm so grateful to all of you on this panel. That was a really remarkable conversation. I've been texting, I don't have a pen where I'm sitting, and I've been texting myself every single remark. You should see what my text thread looks like right now. Maybe I'll share it with everybody, but it's just all these incredible words of truth and wisdom. And I thought on some notion that I would try to organize them and repeat them back, and that just seems impossible at the moment. Plus, you've all been sitting for a really long time, so we are just going to call this day to a close, but it is not the close of anything. I feel like there's remarkable opportunities ahead for us, thinking about everything from where the intersection on this Venn diagram is of all of these issues when it comes to democracy, and whether democracy is the question or the problem or the vision at all. And I'm so grateful that you raised that, Dr. Parrott, and this gives us so much to talk about and think about going forward. I know we've got a lot of folks from different orbits in the room. From the law school, we've got lawyers. We don't have too many doctors, or one. And we have folks from philanthropy, and we have allies, and we have friends. And I promise you that the Burnbound Women's Leadership Network, soon to be Burnbound Women's Leadership Center, is going to continue to be a convener on this conversation. We're going to continue to be a thinker and a catalyzer. And we are so excited for you all to be part of the movement and motion going forward. Thank you so much for being here today. You're welcome to stay here and hang out. We said 3 o'clock on the screen, but we knew we were ending at around 2:40. But you're welcome to stay and continue to commune with each other. And again, just thank you, folks who are here for or are receiving CLE. Remember, you do need to sign out to qualify for your CLE. And again, thank you to Claire Whitman. Thank you to Shirley Dang. Thank you to Melissa Murray, my wonderful partner in crime. We are just so, our hearts are very full. Thank you so much for being part of today.